This is Business 355, Problem 9-25, and we're doing a flexible budget calculation here. And the flexible budget calculation is for a company called Centrico Medical Laboratory. The instructions that were given to us in the McGraw-Hill textbook, found on page 391 according to my e-book, they tell us that we have a couple of things to do. The required says, first of all, prepare a new performance report. Just a second. Here it is. Prepare a new performance report for September using the flexible budget approach. Note, even though there are no revenues in this setting, the flexible budget approach can still be used to prepare a flexible budget performance report, and we can use Exhibit 9-4 as the guide. So let me flash that up here for you. So we're basically calculating the actual number of units and the actual results compared to the flexible budget, and that's what we would have predicted at the 220,000 units of activity, and then the variance is unfavorable or favorable. We determine that by comparing the actual column to the flexible budget column. So a lower sales value is unfavorable, a lower cost value is favorable. So if we have 869 versus 880 for direct materials, that's a favorable variance. The direct labor variance, the actual cost is higher than the flexible budget, so that's unfavorable. So let's see if we can go back to where we came from. Okay, we're back. Now we're going to use that basically as a guide to calculate the flexible budget and to calculate the variances, and then we're going to answer the question, do you think any of the variances in the report you prepared should be investigated, and why? So we'll discuss that. Well, I'll discuss that, and you can tell me if you disagree with my assessment. Alright, so we have a little bit of information up here. Centrico Medical Laboratory, government-sponsored charity, located on the island of Santa Lucretia. I don't know where that is. It may be imaginary. The laboratory has just finished its operations for September, which was a busy month because of a chemical spill that affected a number of other islands. The chemical spill was not a problem on Santa Lucretia, but the residents willingly donated supplies. The laboratory assisted in medical testing, and so that's what they do. They do medical testing. As a consequence, the medical laboratory collected and processed over 25% more laboratory samples from potentially ill residents than had been originally planned for the month. So their budget variance is looking really, really bad because everything is overcosted. So you've spent $33,000 when you should have spent $25,000 according to their static predicted budget. A report prepared by a government official comparing actual costs to costs included in the static budget for the medical laboratory appears below, and the East Caribbean dollar results show that it's not very good news because your budget variance is well above the costs that you're expecting. Of course, that's because of the actual level of samples collected was 920 versus the 700 you predicted in your static budget. The managing director of the medical laboratory is unhappy with the report, claiming that his costs were higher than expected due to the emergency on the neighboring islands. He also points out the additional costs were fully covered by payments from grateful recipients on the other islands. The government official who prepared the report counters that all of the figures were submitted by the medical laboratory to the government. He's just pointing out that actual costs were considerably higher than promised in the budget. Okay, so you can see why we would need a flexible budget, because most of the variance we would expect would be due simply to the higher level of activity. So let me tuck that away. You may want to take a screenshot. Let me see if I can get it lined up so you can actually see all the relevant information. That's probably enough information right there. So at least you can get all the information. And So take a screenshot, and you'll use that for the completion of the rest of the problem. Alright, in setting up our calculation here, we want to set up the variable costs. So let's put that in here, variable. And that would include medical supplies, basically just taking the list, and lab tests, and refreshments, and admin supplies. Okay, then we've got some fixed costs down here. Actually, you know what? It will look a little nicer if we just grab that and cut that off of there and put it over here. And then we'll do the same with fixed. Okay, there we go. Can't do that on the whiteboard. Alright, so among the fixed costs, there are staff salaries. And then we also have equipment depreciation. And we have some rent. And we have some utilities. Okay. So we have the total variable, variable cost, total fixed cost, and then total cost. Okay. So whereas we've got the actual cost and the static budget, and then a static budget variance, we're going to be calculating an actual result. So let's give this the room to do that. Actual, and flex budget. We could compare the static budget, I suppose. And then we'll do the flex budget variance. And we'll put a number there, and we'll put favorable or unfavorable over here. Alrighty, so just pulling all of these bits of information from the given data. Actually, let me slip in a little more information here. I'll insert some rows, and then we'll just put in laboratory samples, lab samples collected, which is just straight from the given information. And calculate flex budget for 920. They thought that there wasn't going to be any chemical spills, so they predicted 700. So our flex budget has a zero difference, and it's neither unfavorable nor favorable. Alright, so medical supplies. Let's give ourselves a column here for calculating the rate, particularly for the variable cost. And so what we do there is we just take the total actual, or the total static budget cost. So let's fill in the static budget, 10640. The lab tests, 12915. Refreshments, 1435. Admin supplies, 490. And then the fixed costs, 1800. Excuse me. And 2850 for depreciation. Of course, the accountants told us that number. Okay, the utilities, 450. And so, those are all the actual values. This number is 25,350. The total, our total variable cost bouncing up here, 25,480. And so our total cost is 50,830. Of course, in our accounting way of doing things, we usually put a couple of lines in here to indicate subtotals, and we'll do it again here. Top border, then a bottom border, and here we just want the double underline because that's total costs, so double underline there, bottom double border. Okay, so in all of these ones we're going to want to have accounting style number. So there we go, and take away those extra zeros and we're good. Okay, so now for all of the variable costs, we know that the variable costs generally tend to be related to the number of units of activity. So the rate is going to be the static budget amount, divided by the static budget predicted level of activity. Now if we hit F4, doesn't actually change anything there, so let's try that. You see the dollar sign show up, and that just says that the column H and the row 4 are being established as the same for all of the ones that we do calculations based on this one or copied from this one. So $15.20 is our medical supply cost per lab sample collected, and so we just work our way down. So this one is going to be 12,915 divided by 700, 1435 divided by 700, and 490 divided by 700. We may want to use a sum to calculate these numbers. These hit the big sigma, and those are the numbers they're supposed to be, 25,480 and 25,350. And this one is just going to be the total of that one plus that one. Alright, so we'll carry those sums across, and of course now we're just calculating. I suppose we could calculate the total here, couldn't we? Let's calculate the total of all of that. So $36.40 is the average total cost. A little paintbrush was the format. So 36, oh, we need some more digits there. I'm not quite sure what happened to our digits. So let's get some extra digits there. There we go. 3640. Okay, so that all agrees with the static budget. Now the next step is to apply these to the flexible budget. So all of these fixed costs, the static budget for fixed costs should be exactly the same as the flex budget for fixed cost, because all of them are not affected by the volume of activity. So we just carry those over. How about these ones? The flexible budget costs should be equal to this number, and once again we'll make that an absolute number, and we're going to multiply that by the rate over here. Alright, and then we can just carry it down to the bottom, and then we can grab the sum. We'll carry it that way, and then we'll carry it this way. Oops, don't do that. I just want the little corner thingy. There we go. Like that. Do the same thing here. Carry it this way, and then carry it back over all the way to that. I'm being very fine with my, there we go. And then this, we carry it that way, and then we'll carry it this way. Alright, so the amount of this flexible budget represents the cost of all of these variable items that we would have expected if we had known in advance that the 920 was the actual level of activity, and of course the fact that the fixed costs don't change with the change in the level of activity. Alright, so the next step is to fill in the actual costs, and these are just taken from The problem, 14,878 and 16,173, and refreshments 1779, and admin supplies 284, and the fixed costs, the actual staff salaries were the same. The equipment depreciation was a little higher. Presumably that would be depreciation based on the units of production. If you remember from 253, that was one of the options for depreciation calculations. The rent didn't change because we did more stuff. The utilities went up a little bit because we were probably working a little overtime. And so that gives us the 25,686 fixed cost of 33,114, variable costs, and the total actual cost of 58,800, which is a lot more acceptable when you compare it to the flex budget than it was for the static budget. It looked like they were $8,000 over budget according to the static budget, but that was mostly because we had the wrong level of activity. So now let's calculate some variances. The variance is just the difference between the actual cost and the flexible budget cost. So there we overspent by 894. Just click on this and we'll do the calculations all the way down. So the actual cost for medical supplies was a little higher than our flex budget would have indicated. So that's an unfavorable variance. That's a favorable, that's a favorable, and that's a favorable variance, and that's a favorable variance. When we say it's a favorable variance, we say it's favorable because the actual cost was less than the flexible budget. We can do the same calculation, down here. We can just copy that and put it here. And then carry it down. So once again, this is an unfavorable variance. This is neither favorable nor unfavorable. And this is an unfavorable variance as well. And this is an unfavorable variance. Overall, the total cost was slightly favorable, which means that our actual cost was slightly less than the flex budget would have predicted. So that right there is our flexible budget. And we can see there's a couple of items that are unfavorable, but most of them come out as a favorable variance, which means we spent less than we would have expected to spend at 920 units of activity. So the question that we were asked is, do you think any of the variances in the report that you prepared should be investigated? And if so, why? Well, we've got a $58,000 budget. So $58,000 is our total budget. And we've got some variances of less than $1,000. So on a $100,000 budget, $1,000 would be a 1% difference. So this is about a 2% difference, less than a 2% difference. $1,000 on 50,000. Total budget would be about a 2% difference. There aren't very many huge differences here. If you calculate them as a percentage, and we can probably do that quite easily because we're in Excel. Can't do this on a whiteboard, but you can certainly do it in Excel. So let's take that as a percentage of the budget. At 6.3% of the budget, let's just drag that all the way down. Okay, keep dragging. And we'll get rid of some of the ones that don't make a lot of sense. Okay. Delete. And then we'll go up. And we'll delete that one and that one. Okay. So the amount of the variances is pretty small. There were a couple that were fairly large, though. Admin supplies. Admin supplies, we spend a lot more. Or we expected to spend a lot more on admin supplies than we actually did. So that's quite a favorable variance, but doesn't really require investigation, I wouldn't think. What might require some investigation is the equipment depreciation, but I suspect that that's probably because it's a unit of production kind of depreciation as opposed to a use over time kind of method. So that probably explains that one. This one's significant in size, but it's not significant in total. So we've got a $600 budget, and we've spent much less than that. we actually had a very favorable variance, but it's not a significantly impactful part of the budget. So I wouldn't say there's a whole lot that we need to investigate. The overall variance is a favorable variance, and only slightly. None of the unfavorable variances is very large, particularly when viewed as a percentage of the budget. Our largest 894 unfavorable variance is 6% of the budget for the period when adjusted for the volume of activity. So the flex budget eliminates the variance that is due to the volume of activity, and so it explains most of the difference between the actual cost and the flex budget in this example. So to interpret that, to interpret the static budget variance as the government official has done, to say that they overspent their budget, ignores the fact that most of the variance was due to the volume of activity. There's a note in the solution that talks about the equipment depreciation variance here. It says, some may wonder why there was a variance in depreciation. Fixed costs can change, they just don't vary with the level of activity. Depreciation may have increased because of the acquisition of new equipment, or because of a loss on equipment that must be scrapped, and this assumes that the loss flows through the depreciation account on the performance report. You usually wouldn't see that in the performance report. The loss on sale isn't really due to the activities of the managers. But another possible explanation would be that it is units of production kind of depreciation. In which case, I suppose you would have an argument for treating it as a variable cost. But we'll leave that discussion for another day. That's it for problem 9-25. We're done. And the remaining problems that I have included in our in-class list, I've left those as exercises for you to do. They're basically fairly comprehensive budgets that you could use to practice your budgeting skills and check to see whether the solution was what you expected it to be.